Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm James Marklove, and I'm joined today by Marc, Barry, and David Notley from Enclave Networks, veterans of the Innovate UK, LORCA and Startupbootcamp accelerators. Good morning to you both.
Hi, James.
Morning, James.
Now, we're here today to talk about how we get rid of VPN servers. For our listeners who perhaps aren't familiar with this theme or accept VPN as part of the remote working infrastructure, David, perhaps you can tell us why this is such an interesting topic and why it should be on people's agenda.
Thanks, James. Yeah, it is an interesting topic. It does sound a bit niche, but I think in reality, it's something which affects all organizations that need to run their private networks via the internet. The reason why we focus specifically on VPN servers rather than VPNs as a topic in itself, virtual private networks, is because it's actually the VPN servers themselves which cause the challenge, because they are essentially a hub and spoke topology. Not only are they hub and spoke topology, but they allow ingress to your private networks from anywhere in the world, from anybody. And that publicly available portal into your private networks is not something which ideally you should have.
Now, Marc, I read an article on Tech Radar that of the top 25 security vulnerabilities listed by the NSA, over half of those were related to VPNs and RDP. Why is this not a topic of wider discussion, in your opinion?
Thanks, James. So I think that's a really good question. It really depends on what sort of conversations you're part of. So, for example, in October of 2019, the British NCSC took the unusual step of publicly publishing vulnerabilities that have been discovered in several major SSL VPN products. So Pulse, Connect, Secure, Fortinet, and Palo Alto were all vendors which NCSC published warnings about, because pre-auth vulnerabilities have been found in these products. So that is to say that before you've had the ability to proceed through authentication, that have been discovered in these products that would allow anything from arbitrary file reading to command injection to unauthenticated attackers being able to remotely change the passwords of VPN users on the portal, all the way down to actual remote code execution on certain devices. But I think this is one of those topics that's not particularly sexy, and actually the impact of these vulnerabilities, unless you've been exploited, is confined to a fairly narrow corner of the organization.
So if I'm understanding correctly, this is an inherent flaw in the technology and one that we have accepted for years. David, why do you think that now this is becoming a bigger issue for organizations and one that needs to be addressed directly?
Yes, so what you're pointing out here is that there is an inherent vulnerability in most VPN servers because they rely on the fact that you connect to them before you authenticate yourself. So the fact that these servers are visible on the public internet for anybody to see, anybody to connect to, introduces inherent vulnerabilities. So one of the solutions that we have introduced with Enclave is to do authentication prior to connection. And what that effectively means is that your services, your private VPN, which runs on top of the public internet, is invisible to that public internet. So nothing can connect to it unless it carries out authentication first. And that really is much more of a zero trust philosophy in terms of the way in which these kind of connectivity pathways are established. And I think it's that sort of fairly simple paradigm shift which people are beginning to take notice of now. So rather than connect, then authenticate, you have a paradigm shift where you authenticate and then connect, rendering your systems invisible to the public internet.
Now, would you say that this is potentially, this paradigm shift in thinking is potentially a challenge for either security or IT teams, particularly those that are really focused on availability and maintaining reasonable connections and reasonable usability for end users whilst they are working remotely?
So I think we have to draw an important distinction here. There is VPN connectivity, which is something that we all agree is important and necessary. And then there are VPN servers that facilitate that connectivity. So the VPN server acts as a gateway device. It sits at the edge of the network. And when parties connect to its front door, the job of the VPN server is to place those remote parties onto the network. And as soon as you're on the network, then you have to start contending with all of the problems that come with being on the network. You have to be able to prevent lateral movements. You have to be able to apply access controls. And all of a sudden, the administrators, just through enabling remote access, now have to start thinking about their VLANs and their subnets, and it becomes somewhat of a leaky abstraction. So what we're really advocating for here is not the death of the VPN, but the death of the VPN server. And one of the analogies that we often use when we're explaining this is that today the internet is a lot like our road networks. We've got our cars and our lorries. If we consider those to be a little bit like our IP packets, our data crossing the network, then today anybody can get in their car and they can drive to your house, effectively your VPN server or any remote services that you're offering, be it SSH, RDP, doesn't really matter. Somebody can get in their car and they can drive to your house. Now, even if they don't have a key to get in through the front door, they can peer through the windows, they can try the locks, and worst case, they can wait around for an opportunity to enter. And so if you're an organization that relies on connectivity, the VPN server is actually a pretty terrible base upon which to build your security infrastructure because they're accepting inbound traffic from the public internet. This makes them vulnerable to a plethora of vulnerabilities, inherently vulnerable, not just to vulnerabilities, but to undesirable behavior from port scanning through to credential stuffing, potentially across to zero-day exploitation in certain cases. And it always puts organizations on the back foot because they have to be proactively patching and checking that these front doors are appropriately secured and closed to all but the correct people.
Now, you're already working with a number of customers at Enclave. What sort of cost-benefit analysis have you looked at for replacing the more traditional infrastructure? And in addition to improved security, what other outcomes can organizations expect for taking a different approach?
So that's a really good question, James. We as businesses, and depending on the nature of your business, you might just be exposed to the remote access side of the world. But a lot of organizations, increasingly in the DevOps space and cloud infrastructure environments, are also exposed to the data center. And typically, when we build connectivity for remote access, it looks very, very different to connectivity in the data center. Different products, different solutions. But fundamentally, what we're looking for as businesses is secure private connectivity, either for humans or for machines. And what that means is that even though we have different solutions in different parts of our business, administrators still have to consider how they configure their firewalls, of course, the VPNs, how they manage IP addresses, subnets, access control lists, NAT routing tables, certificates, secret keys. There's a huge amount of back office activities that go into building secure connectivity. And these are often activities that don't necessarily differentiate from the competition. They just tend to actually get in the way and slow people down. And of course, you have to remember to come around and take it all down again after access expires. So on the one hand, you've got lots of manual error-prone work, which can introduce vulnerabilities, often carries inherent risks when you're changing your network, risks of security changes that don't go quite right, or risks to availability as you're reconfiguring the things. And then on the other side, you also have this issue to contend with, that your VPN server, your web server, your desktop, your SSH ports, these are all exposed to the public internet and are vulnerable to all sorts of attacks and as I say, undesirable behavior, unless you know in advance where somebody's coming from. And then you get back into that situation then where you have to start maintaining access control lists again. So there's a huge amount of overhead, and it's really hidden overhead that we tend to take for granted that this is just the way that things are, because in truth, it is the way that things have been for the last 20 years or so. And I think one of the key messages that we have to our customers at Enclave Networks is that it doesn't actually have to be that way.
If we return to our original question, how do we get rid of VPN servers? The takeaways for our listeners today should be that a paradigm shift from connection followed by authentication to authentication and then connection is at the root of why moving away from that more traditional technology would be beneficial, and that there are a number of different benefits of doing that. Would that be a fair summary?
I think so, yes, James. So in order to make your systems private to the public internet, you do have to adopt a more zero trust philosophy, which is based, as we've discussed already, on authentication, meeting trust standards before connectivity is permitted. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, which is equally important, is at the moment, as Marc was saying earlier, we've just got used to this idea that networks have to be complicated. They're just a maze of connections with all sorts of different dimensions and elements to them, which we have to manage and control. So what we're trying to do at Enclave Networks is two things, really. Is first of all to make networks fundamentally more secure by taking a more zero trust approach to network connectivity, but secondly also trying to simplify things, to remove complexity. So what you're then able to do is to get the network out of the way, is to work in an environment where you can just make connections without having to make changes to your underlying network infrastructure. And I think the most important takeaway is that you can always leave your firewalls closed. Your firewalls do not have to be open. You're using outward bound traffic only, and that makes them fundamentally more secure, but simpler to deploy as well.
Very good. Well, when we release this for general consumption, we'll also include some links to the Enclave website. And I'm sure both David and Marc, you'll be very happy to hear from anybody who wants to find out more directly. Marc Barry, David Notley from Enclave Networks, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.